The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty courtyard of Fort Henderson as the wagon train rumbled through the gates, bringing with it the familiar sounds of creaking wheels and weary travelers. It was October 1869, and the Arizona Territory was still a harsh and unforgiving place where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers and the strength of one's own will. Captain Marcus Whitman stood on the wooden porch of his quarters, watching the arrival with the practiced eye of a man who had seen too much human suffering in his 33 years. The Civil War had ended 4 years ago, but its aftermath still rippled through the frontier in ways both subtle and profound. This particular wagon train carried former slaves heading west in search of new lives and fresh starts. But Marcus could see even from a distance that the journey had taken its toll. His 5-year-old daughter, Emma, tugged at his sleeve with small, insistent fingers. Her blonde curls caught the golden light as she stood on tiptoe to see over the porch railing, her blue dress crisp despite the day's heat. Emma had been asking about the wagon train since the dust cloud appeared on the horizon an hour earlier. Her natural curiosity about the world around her never satisfied. "Daddy, who are all those people?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the innocent directness that only children possess. "They're travelers, sweetheart," Marcus replied, lifting her up so she could see better. "People looking for new homes and new opportunities." Among the dusty figures climbing down from the wagons, one person caught Marcus's attention immediately. A young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, moved with careful deliberation as she helped an elderly man down from the wagon bed. Even from across the courtyard, Marcus could see the iron shackles around her ankles, the heavy chains that marked her as different from the other travelers. The woman wore a rough burlap dress that had seen far better days. Her dark hair pulled back severely, and her face bore the careful mask of someone who had learned to make herself invisible to avoid drawing unwanted attention. But there was something in the way she carried herself, a dignity that couldn't be broken by chains or circumstances. That made Marcus look twice. "Daddy, why does that lady have chains on her feet?" Emma asked, her young voice carrying clearly in the still air. The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. How did you explain to a 5-year-old child the complexities of a world where human beings could still be bought and sold, where freedom was a commodity rather than a birthright? In Emma's innocent worldview, people were simply people, worthy of kindness and respect, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances that brought them to your door. "I don't know, little bird," Marcus said quietly, using the pet name he'd called Emma since she was a baby. "But I think we should find out." Marcus set Emma down gently and made his way across the courtyard toward the wagon train. As the fort's commanding officer, it was his duty to welcome new arrivals and assess any potential threats or needs. But something about the chained woman compelled him beyond mere official responsibility. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Pete Sullivan, whom Marcus had met several times before, approached with his usual businesslike demeanor. Behind him walked a well-dressed man in an expensive suit who clearly saw himself as someone of importance. "Captain Whitman," Sullivan said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Good to see you again. This here's Mr. Jeremiah Blackwood. He's got some business he'd like to discuss with you." Blackwood stepped forward with the confident air of a man accustomed to getting his way. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and cold gray eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked upon. "Captain," Blackwood said, extending a manicured hand, "I represent certain business interests back east, and I understand you might be in need of domestic help here at the fort." Marcus shook the offered hand briefly, his attention still drawn to the chained woman who stood quietly beside the wagon. Up close, he could see that she was even younger than he had first thought, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of her own thoughts. "What kind of domestic help?" Marcus asked carefully. "I have here a woman trained in all aspects of household management," Blackwood continued smoothly. "Cooking, cleaning, childcare, sewing. She's quite skilled, and I'm prepared to offer very reasonable terms for her services." "Her services," Marcus repeated, his voice taking on an edge that made several nearby soldiers glance in his direction. "Indeed. A 2-year contract, very standard terms. She would work for room and board plus a small wage, and at the end of the period, she would be free to seek other employment. Marcus looked directly at the woman for the first time, noting how she kept her eyes downcast in the manner of someone who had learned that drawing attention often led to trouble. But when she did glance up briefly, he saw intelligence there and something else, a spark of defiance that hadn't been entirely extinguished by whatever circumstances had brought her to this point. "What's her name?" Marcus asked. Blackwood waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, she goes by whatever name her employer prefers. Makes things simpler, you understand. Less confusion." The casual way the man discussed stripping away someone's very identity made Marcus's jaw clench with barely controlled anger. Emma had wandered over during the conversation and now stood beside her father, looking up at the chained woman with the frank curiosity of childhood. "What's your real name?" Emma asked the woman directly, her small voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that fell over the group. The woman looked down at Emma with surprise, clearly not expecting to be addressed directly. For a moment, her carefully maintained mask slipped, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the person beneath the circumstances. "My name is Grace," she said softly, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had received education despite her current situation. "Grace Washington." "That's a pretty name," Emma said with the straightforward honesty of a child. "I'm Emma. Why do you have chains on your feet? Are you a prisoner?" "Emma," Marcus said gently, but Grace shook her head slightly. "It's all right," she said, kneeling down to Emma's level despite the difficulty the shackles caused. "I have chains because some people think I belong to them. But I don't think anyone should belong to anyone else, do you?" Emma shook her head emphatically. "That's silly. People belong to themselves." The wisdom of childhood cut through the complex justifications and legal technicalities that adults use to explain away injustice. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest as he watched his daughter interact with Grace, seeing past all the surface differences to the fundamental humanity they shared. "Mr. Blackwood," Marcus said, turning back to the businessman. "I'm afraid we won't be needing your services after all." Blackwood's face darkened. "Captain, I think you misunderstand the situation. This woman is legally bound to fulfill her contract. The law is quite clear on these matters." "The law," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of his military rank and personal conviction, "is changing, Mr. Blackwood, and I have no intention of participating in any arrangement that treats human beings as property." "Sir, I must protest," Blackwood began, but Marcus held up his hand. "The discussion is closed. I suggest you move along before I decide to investigate the legal basis for those shackles more thoroughly." Blackwood looked as if he wanted to argue further, but something in Marcus's expression convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. He stalked back toward the wagons, muttering under his breath about interfering military officers and changing times. Marcus knelt down beside Grace, who was still at Emma's eye level. "Miss Washington," he said formally, "would you be willing to accept honest employment here at the fort-paid position, proper quarters, and no contracts other than the mutual agreement that you'll work hard and be treated with the respect due any member of our community?" Grace looked up at him with something approaching disbelief. "Sir, I don't understand. You don't know anything about me, about my circumstances or my past." "I know enough," Marcus said simply. "I know that you've been treated unjustly, and I know that my daughter sees something in you worth defending. That's recommendation enough for me." "But the chains," Grace said, looking down at the iron shackles that bound her ankles. Marcus stood and called over his shoulder to one of his sergeants. "Sergeant Morrison, bring me the largest hammer you can find and something to use as an anvil." "Sir," the sergeant replied, clearly confused but following orders. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Emma asked, watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "I'm going to help Grace get free of those chains, little bird," Marcus said, "because no person should have to wear chains in order to be themselves." When Sergeant Morrison returned with the requested tools, Marcus knelt beside Grace again. "This might be loud and a bit frightening," he warned, "but I promise I'll be careful." Grace nodded. though Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly as she positioned her feet on the makeshift anvil. The iron shackles were well made and sturdy, designed to last and to remind their wearer constantly of their status. But they were also old, and iron could be broken by someone with the right tools and the determination to use them. The first blow of the hammer rang out across the courtyard like a bell, drawing the attention of soldiers and civilians alike. Marcus worked with steady precision, each strike calculated to weaken the metal without injuring the woman who wore it. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling afternoon air, and his muscles ached from the repetitive motion. But he continued until finally, with a sharp crack, the first shackle split and fell away. Grace stared down at her freed ankle as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. When Marcus began work on the second shackle, she watched his face with growing wonder, searching for some sign of what he expected in return for this act of liberation. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the ringing of hammer on iron. Marcus paused in his work to meet her eyes. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because my daughter is watching, and I want her to grow up in a world where people help each other instead of exploiting each other. And because everyone deserves a chance to start over." With the second shackle broken and discarded, Grace stood slowly, seeming almost surprised by her own freedom of movement. She took a few tentative steps, marveling at the simple ability to walk without the weight and restriction of the chains. Emma clapped her hands with delight. "Now you can walk properly, Grace. Can you come see my dollhouse? I have tea parties, and you could come if you want." Grace looked down at the little girl with tears gathering in her eyes. "I would like that very much, Emma. But first I think your father and I need to discuss what kind of work I'll be doing here." Over the following days, Grace settled into life at Fort Henderson with a quiet efficiency that impressed everyone who encountered her. Marcus had arranged for her to have a small but comfortable room in the officers' quarters, and she had thrown herself into her new responsibilities with a dedication that spoke of genuine gratitude rather than mere obligation. She proved to be everything Blackwood had claimed, and more. An excellent cook who could create satisfying meals from basic military rations. A skilled seamstress who could mend uniforms and create clothing from scratch. And a natural teacher who took Emma's education in hand with patience and creativity. But more than her practical skills, Grace brought something to the fort that had been missing, a gentleness and grace that softened the harsh edges of military life. Emma had taken to Grace immediately, following her around the fort and chattering constantly about everything from the behavior of the fort's chickens to the stories Grace told about far-off places and different ways of life. For Grace, who had been separated from her own family years earlier, Emma's innocent affection was a balm to wounds she had thought would never heal. "Miss Grace," Emma said one afternoon as they worked together in the small garden behind the quarters, "why don't you have a family?" Grace paused in her weeding, considering how to answer such a direct question honestly without burdening a child with adult sorrows. "I did have a family once," she said carefully. "But sometimes families get separated, and people have to make new families with the people who care about them. Like you and me and Daddy," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Like you and me and your daddy," Grace agreed, though the words carried more weight than the child could. Understand, Marcus had been watching the developing relationship between Grace and his daughter with a mixture of gratitude and something else he wasn't quite ready to name. Emma had been without a mother's influence since birth, her own mother having died in childbirth, and Marcus had done his best to fill both parental roles. But seeing Emma with Grace showed him things he had missed, needs he hadn't even realized his daughter had. Grace brought out a different side of Emma, encouraging her natural curiosity while teaching her the social graces and domestic skills that Marcus couldn't provide. She read to Emma from books of poetry and adventure stories, taught her to sew neat stitches and bake bread that filled the quarters with wonderful aromas, and listened with genuine interest to the child's endless questions and observations about the world around her. But it was the evening, conversations after Emma was asleep, that Marcus found himself looking forward to most. Grace was intelligent and well-read, able to discuss everything from literature to politics to the changing nature of the frontier with insights that challenged his own thinking. She had a perspective on the world that came from seeing it from the bottom up, and her observations often cut straight to the heart of issues that others talked around. "The war may be over," Grace said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, "but the real work of rebuilding is just beginning. And it's not just about putting buildings back together or re-establishing trade routes. It's about deciding what kind of country we want to be." "What kind of country do you think we should be?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "One where a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth," Grace said without hesitation. "One where children like Emma can grow up believing that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and where that belief actually matches the reality they encounter." "That's a beautiful vision," Marcus said. "Do you think it's possible?" "I have to believe it's possible," Grace replied. "Because if it's not, then all the suffering and struggle has been for nothing. And I refuse to accept that." The conviction in her voice stirred something in Marcus that had been dormant since his wife's death. He had focused all his energy on his military duties and raising Emma, leaving no room for personal desires or dreams beyond providing security and stability for his daughter. But Grace's presence in their lives had awakened possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider. One afternoon in November, as the first cold winds began to sweep down from the mountains, Emma came running into the house with tears streaming down her face. She threw herself into Grace's arms, sobbing with the inconsolable grief that only children can experience over what adults might consider minor disappointments. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Grace asked, holding Emma close and stroking her hair. "My doll," Emma hiccuped. "She fell in the horse trough and now she's all wet and dirty and her dress is ruined." "Is she dying? Miss Grace, is my dolly going to die?" Grace looked down at the sodden, bedraggled doll that Emma clutched to her chest, its painted face smeared and its cloth body stained with muddy water. To an adult, it was clearly just a toy that needed cleaning and repair. But to Emma, it represented something precious that might be lost forever. "Oh, sweetheart," Grace said gently, "your dolly isn't dying. She's just had an adventure that got her very dirty. But we can fix her up good as new." "Really?" Emma asked, hope creeping back into her voice. "Really?" Grace confirmed. "We'll give her a nice bath, make her a beautiful new dress, and she'll be even prettier than before. Sometimes when things get damaged, we can make them better than they were originally." Marcus, who had been watching from the doorway, felt his heart clench at the tenderness in Grace's voice as she comforted his daughter. But more than that, he was struck by the deeper meaning in her words about making damaged things better than they were originally. He wondered if she was talking about more than just a child's toy. Over the next few days, Grace worked with Emma to restore the damaged doll. They carefully cleaned the painted face, restuffed the body with fresh cotton, and created an elaborate new dress from scraps of fabric that Grace had been saving. Emma watched every step of the process with fascination, learning not just practical skills, but important lessons about patience, care, and the possibility of renewal. "You see," Grace said as they put the finishing touches on the doll's new outfit, "sometimes the most beautiful things come from taking something that's been hurt or damaged and giving it new life." Emma held up the restored doll, admiring the intricate embroidery on the new dress and the fresh brightness of the cleaned face. "She's even more beautiful than before," Emma declared. "It's like she's a whole new dolly, but still the same dolly." "Exactly," Grace said. But her eyes met Marcus's over Emma's head, and he saw in them a message meant for him. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed clutching her renewed doll, Marcus found Grace sitting by the fire mending one of his shirts. The domestic scene struck him with unexpected force, and he realized that somewhere along the way, this arrangement that had begun as simple employment had become something much more complex and precious. "Grace," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." She looked up from her sewing, her expression alert but calm. "Of course. Are you happy here?" he asked. "I mean truly happy, not just grateful for a safe place to stay." Grace set down her sewing and considered the question seriously. "I'm happier than I ever thought I could be again," she said finally. "When I was brought here in those chains, I thought my life was essentially over. I thought I would spend whatever years I had left simply surviving, getting through each day until there were no more days left." She paused, looking into the fire as if gathering her thoughts. "But you and Emma have given me something I thought was lost forever. The chance to be myself again. To use my mind, to care for people who care about me in return, to feel like I have value beyond just the work I can perform." "And what about the future?" Marcus asked quietly. "What do you want for yourself beyond just surviving?" Grace met his eyes directly, and he saw in them a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "I want what I think most people want. To love and be loved, to have a family, to feel like I belong somewhere. I want to wake up each morning with purpose and go to bed each night feeling like I've contributed something meaningful to the world." "And if you could have all of that," Marcus said, his heart pounding with the audacity of what he was about to suggest, "would you want to have it here with Emma and me?" Grace stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through surprise, hope, and something that might have been fear. "Marcus, what are you asking?" "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife," he said simply. "Not because you owe me anything, not because you need protection or security, but because somewhere along the way, I've fallen in love with the woman who reads poetry to my daughter and sees possibilities where others see only problems." Tears gathered in Grace's eyes, but she didn't look away. "Do you mean that are you really asking me to marry you, knowing what you know about my past? About where I came from? I'm asking you to marry me because of who you are. Not despite where you came from," Marcus said firmly. "You're the strongest, most resilient person I've ever known. You've faced things that would have broken most people, and you've come through them with your humanity intact. You've made our house into a home, and you've made both Emma and me better people just by being part of our lives." "But people will talk," Grace said quietly. "A white officer marrying a former slave, it's not something people will accept easily." "Let them talk," Marcus said with conviction. "Emma asked me once why you had chains on your feet, and I realized that I want her to grow up in a world where the answer to that question is, because people used to do terrible things, but we don't do them anymore. I want her to see that love doesn't have anything to do with the color of someone's skin or their past circumstances." Grace stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled desert sky. When she turned back to Marcus, her face was radiant with a joy she couldn't hide. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, not because I need security or protection, but because I love you both more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." Marcus crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. How right this felt despite all the reasons why the world might say it was wrong. "There's just one thing," Grace said, pulling back to look at him seriously. "What's that?" "I want Emma to be part of the ceremony. I want her to know that when I become your wife, I'm also choosing to become her mother in every way that matters." "I think she would love that," Marcus said, thinking of his daughter's immediate acceptance of Grace and her innocent understanding that families could be created by choice as well as birth. They were married. 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the fort's chapel, with Emma serving as both flower girl and ring bearer. Grace wore a dress of blue silk that she had sewn herself, and Marcus wore his dress uniform with Emma's help in tying his tie properly. The guest list was small but meaningful. The officers and their families who had come to respect Grace, the enlisted men who had benefited from her kindness, and the few civilians in the area who understood that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that society tried to impose. Emma stood between them during the ceremony, one small hand in each of theirs, beaming with the satisfaction of someone who had known all along that this was how things were supposed to turn out. When the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife, Emma threw her arms around both of them and declared loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Now we're a real family forever." The years that followed brought both challenges and joys, as all marriages do. There were times when the prejudices of others made their lives difficult, when opportunities were denied or friendships strained because of their unconventional union. But there were also moments of profound happiness, watching Emma grow into a confident young woman who saw the world with eyes unclouded by racial prejudice, welcoming their own children into a home built on love and acceptance, and seeing Grace blossom into the person she was always meant to be. Grace became not just Marcus's wife, but a respected member of the community, known for her intelligence, her compassion, and her tireless work on behalf of other displaced families seeking new starts on the frontier. She established a school for children of all backgrounds, taught literacy classes for adults, and served as an unofficial counselor for anyone facing the challenges of rebuilding their lives in a new place. Emma grew up with siblings who looked different from her but shared her sense of justice and her belief that all people deserve to be treated with dignity. She would later write in her memoirs about the profound impact of having Grace as a mother, how it shaped her understanding of strength, resilience, and the power of love to overcome societal barriers. But perhaps the most meaningful testament to their love story came years later, when Emma's own daughter asked about the old chains that hung in a place of honor in their family home. Emma told her granddaughter the story of how her father had freed Grace from those physical chains, but more importantly, how Grace had freed all of them from the invisible chains of prejudice, fear, and the inability to see beyond surface differences to the humanity that connects all people. "Grandmama Grace came to us wearing chains," Emma would explain, but Grandpapa gave her a dress, a name, and a second life. And in return, she gave us a family built on love instead of just blood. And she taught us that the most important thing about a person isn't where they come from or what they look like, but how they choose to treat others. The chains remained on display as a reminder of how far they had come and how far society still needed to go. But more than that, they served as a symbol of the truth that Grace had taught them all, that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from taking something that has been hurt or damaged and giving it new life, new purpose, and new hope. In the end, Grace had been right about making damaged things better than they were originally. She had taken a broken family consisting of a widowed father and his motherless child and transformed it into something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. She had taken her own damaged life and created from it a legacy of love, acceptance, and the unshakable belief that every person deserves the chance to write their own story. Regardless of how that story begins, their love story became part of the folklore of the frontier, a tale told around campfires and in family parlors about the power of love to overcome prejudice and the courage it takes to do what's right, even when the world tells you it's wrong. It was a story about second chances, about the families we choose, and the homes we create through love rather than circumstance. Most importantly, it was a story about seeing the person behind the chains, the dignity behind the degradation, and the infinite possibility for renewal that exists in every human heart when it's given the chance to heal and grow and love without limitation. If this story of redemption, love transcending barriers, and the courage to do what's right touched your heart, please share it with others who believe in the power of love to overcome prejudice and create families based on choice rather than circumstance. Your engagement helps these stories of hope and human dignity reach those who may need to be reminded that every person deserves respect, love, and the chance to write their own story. Thank you for being part of a community that celebrates the beauty of seeing beyond surface differences to the humanity we all share.